soft to the touch, deadly to the core. Welcome to Faded Echoes. I am your host, Ombra. Tell me where you're listening from. I love seeing how far our mysteries travel. Your comments make this journey unforgettable. Let's begin. You don't often get to see Nero Wolfe startled. It's not a face built for surprise, too round, too immovable, too smug in its assumption that the rest of us are barely literate in the alphabet of thought. But that evening, a little before 6, when Fritz came in from the hall with a cream envelope on a silver tray, I could have sworn I saw Wolfe's eyes flicker once, like a bear twitching in its sleep. I was at my desk finishing up a report on a domestic tail job that had gone nowhere fast. Wolfe, naturally, was in his chair behind the mahogany desk, hands folded across his belly, doing the kind of work he calls thinking and the rest of us call digestion. The air was heavy with the scent of orchids from upstairs. His greenhouse had been putting out a stubborn bloom of Paphiopedilum fairianum that week, and the silence had that special Wolfe brand, absolute, upholstered, and smug. Fritz said, "A messenger, sir. He waited to see if you would answer." Wolfe grunted. Obviously not. "Yes, sir, but he insisted I deliver it directly." Fritz placed the tray before him with the reverence of a priest offering communion. The envelope was thick, handmade paper, faintly perfumed, sealed with dark red wax bearing the imprint of something ornamental. Wolfe regarded it as though it were a scorpion. "Pui," he said softly, but he slit it open with the ivory knife he keeps for that purpose. I went back to my typing, pretending not to watch. With Wolfe, you don't ask questions before he's decided you're worthy of an answer. The man could have opened a telegram announcing the end of civilization, and you wouldn't know until dinner. He unfolded the letter and read in silence. Then, another flicker. This one was definitely surprise. He read it again, slower, and dropped it on the desk. "Archie." "Yes, sir." "Do you recall a Miss Delia Vance?" I stopped typing. "Vance, sure. Tall, redhead, used to act on Broadway. Came to see you 2 years ago about her husband's will. You told her to forget the law and hire a priest." Wolfe made a small face. "Yes, she returns. Remarried? She writes to inform me of her impending death." That got me up from my chair. "Death?" Wolfe gestured toward the letter. "By her own account, not metaphorical. She claims to have been poisoned, slowly by an invisible velvet." I picked up the page. The handwriting was perfect. Blue ink, long loops, careful flourishes. The kind of script that made you think of scented drawers and scandalous diaries. "My dear Mr. Wolfe, you once told me that folly is often self-inflicted. I'm now the victim of mine. For weeks I felt something coursing through me. Soft, unseen, but relentless, like a velvet death. I'm being killed, and I cannot say by whom. I beg you to keep this letter in case my fear proves true. Delia Vance." There was no date beyond the week's postmark, and no return address, just the initials DV scrawled across the back of the envelope like a sigh. I looked up. "You think she's pulling your leg?" Wolfe's eyes closed. Miss Vance was not the sort of woman who tolerated her own melodrama. If she believed herself in peril, she may well have been. "And you're interested?" He opened them again. "Interested? No. Intrigued, yes. There's a difference." "Uh-huh. And what's the difference between intrigued and interested?" He leaned back, lacing his fingers over his middle. "Dinner. That was Wolfe for you. The universe could crumble, and he'd time it between courses. But something in the way he stared at the letter told me this wasn't just curiosity. A woman who thought she was being murdered had reached out from the edge of death to disturb his brownstone, and that, for Nero Wolfe, was personal trespass. The morning after Delia Vance's letter arrived, I found Nero Wolfe in what passes for his version of activity. Reading. Not just reading, but rereading, which for him is as close as other men get to pacing the floor. The letter was laid out on the stand beside his chair, carefully flattened, its perfumed ghost still faint in the room. Fritz had opened the windows to air out the scent, but it hung there, sly and persistent, like a guest who refuses to leave. I'd already been to the kitchen for coffee and was halfway through my first cup when the doorbell rang. It wasn't the usual lazy afternoon ding-dong we get from salesmen or clients too timid to commit to a full press. It was a hard, urgent stab at the bell. Someone with nerves, not manners. Wolfe didn't move a finger. "Archie." "I figured as much," I said, and headed to the door. A woman stood on the stoop, shoulders hunched against the brisk March air. Not the kind of woman you'd call fragile, though she looked close to breaking. She was dressed in black, good quality, not morning clothes, and carried a slim leather handbag that had seen better evenings. Her hair was dark brown, drawn back in a careful bun, but her eyes, grey, restless, searching, were doing all the talking. "Mr. Goodwin?" she asked, voice tight. I nodded. "That's the name. You're expected." She hesitated. "I sent a wire this morning about Miss Delia Vance." I'll admit it. My pulse gave a little jump. I stepped aside. "Then you'd better come in before the orchids freeze." She moved past me, taking in the hallway like someone cataloguing the room for danger. By the time we reached the office door, Wolfe was already glowering in her direction, which is his way of saying, "Welcome." "Good afternoon," she said quietly. "I'm Helen Arden, Miss Vance's assistant, rather. I received your letter this morning." Wolfe gestured toward the red leather chair opposite his desk. "Sit. You received my letter?" She blinked, confused. No, I mean hers. She mentioned you by name." Wolfe's lips made a thin line. "Proceed." She sat, clutching her handbag like it contained the last thing keeping her anchored. "Miss Vance died last night." Fritz, who had just entered with the tray for Wolfe's beer, stopped cold. Wolfe didn't. He reached for the glass and took a deliberate sip, the sound of it loud in the silence that followed. I took the cue. "Dead how?" Helen's voice trembled slightly but held steady. "In her apartment on East 73rd. The doctor said it was heart failure. But she was healthy. No history. No sign of distress until last week when she started talking about, being poisoned." I glanced at Wolfe, who was studying her as if she were a rare insect crawling across his blotter. "Did she say who might wish her harm?" "She didn't name anyone," Helen said, "but she'd been frightened. She told me someone was sending her gifts. Expensive ones, always anonymous, perfume, gloves, even a small velvet box. She said it smelled strange. Sweet. She called it her velvet death." There it was, the phrase again. Not coincidence. Wolfe leaned back, his eyelids descending halfway. "Miss Arden, I assume you are not here merely to eulogize your employer." Her hands clenched around the bag. "No. I'm here because she wanted you to know. She said if anything happened, I should bring you her diary." That word got his full attention. "Diary?" She opened the bag and produced a small black volume bound in soft leather. It was wrapped in tissue, tied with green silk ribbon, Delia Vance's taste to the last. Wolfe didn't reach for it. "Archie." I took it from her and set it on the desk. The ribbon gave a faint whisper as it came undone. Inside, the pages were filled with her looping script, starting neat and confident, ending shaky and slanted. I flipped to the last entry, dated 3 days ago. "The velvet is everywhere now. On my skin, in my breath. He says I imagine it. But I know. I see the shadow behind the gifts. I feel the perfume in my lungs. Wolfe will understand." I closed it slowly. "Who's he?" Helen shook her head. "I don't know. She didn't confide everything. But there were people, friends if you can call them that. A Mr. Alan Grover, her business partner. Dr. Emery Fenn, who looked after her investments, and a singer, Claudette Morey. She and Miss Vance were rivals once. Rivals in what sense? Wolfe asked. In everything, I suppose, she said softly. Work, money, men. Wolfe made a faint noise that might have been amusement. A tidy triumvirate of motives. Where is this Miss Morey now? She's performing at the Halcyon Club, uptown. And Mr. Grover? He runs the studio on 55th Street. Delia's office was next door. Wolfe folded his hands. And you, Miss Arden, what do you believe? The question hit her hard. She looked at him as if searching for a safe place in his eyes and finding none. I believe she was killed. Slowly. And whoever did it will think they've gotten away clean. I want them caught. Wolfe's gaze drifted toward the diary, then to me. Archie, you will go to Miss Vance's apartment. Speak with the attending physician, the police if necessary. Ascertain the disposition of her effects, especially this perfume and the gifts. Bring back whatever you can without inciting arrest. Lovely. And if the cops object to me rummaging through the ladies' drawers? Charm them. It is your one singular skill. Flattery gets you everything, I said, including the bill. He didn't reply. His attention had turned inward again, eyes half closed, lips moving faintly as if tasting the word velvet. It wasn't just curiosity now, it was irritation. Someone had dared reach into his sanctum through that letter, and Nero Wolfe never forgives intrusion. Helen Arden rose. You'll help then? I have agreed to nothing, Wolfe said, which from him is practically an oath of allegiance. I escorted her out. On the stoop, she turned suddenly. Mr. Goodwin, she said once that if anything ever happened, it would begin with something beautiful, something that seemed harmless. I watched her walk down the steps into the thinning fog. Harmless beauty, slow poison, a dead actress who saw her death coming. When I came back, Wolfe hadn't moved. The diary lay open on the desk, his finger resting on a line near the middle. He didn't look up. Archie, he said, the world is full of women who kill with beauty, but when beauty itself kills, that is worth my time. He closed the book with a soft thud that sounded like the start of trouble. It was past 10 when I got to East 73rd Street. The doorman recognized the name I gave him and told me the police had already been through the place that morning. He said it with the bland neutrality of a man who had seen too many tenants go out feet first to bother developing opinions. Still, I caught the flicker in his eyes when I mentioned Delia Vance, like he was recalling her perfume even now. The apartment was on the 4th floor, a corner suite with a view of the park and curtains drawn against it. The key Helen had given me worked smoothly, which told me the cops hadn't changed the locks. Inside, it was all muted elegance. Soft lights, silver-framed photographs, books arranged like props. The kind of place that makes you whisper without knowing why. I took a slow turn through the living room, noting what Wolfe would want to know. The faint floral scent hanging in the air, a velvet shawl draped over a chair, a cut-glass atomizer sitting by itself on the mantel like a relic. I didn't touch the atomizer. Not yet. If Delia Vance had been right about poison, it could have been her instrument or the weapon aimed at her. The diary had called it sweet. This was that kind of sweetness, the kind that clings. In the bedroom, the bed was neatly made. That told me two things. Someone else had been here since her death, and they wanted it to look like no one had. On the nightstand lay a small silver box, lid open. Inside was a tuft of violet-colored velvet, cut in a perfect square, about 2 inches wide. It looked harmless enough, but it gave me a strange chill just the same. I was crouched by the nightstand when I heard a voice behind me. "You're trespassing, friend." I turned. The man filling the doorway was big, shoulders built for pushing people aside, not for conversation. His overcoat was expensive, his tie cheap, and the combination told me he either didn't care about taste or wanted to look like he didn't. "Archie Goodwin," I said easily. "Private investigator, licensed and semi-housebroken. You are?" "Alan Grover," he said without offering a hand. "Delia's partner. The cops already cleared the place. You've got no business here." "That makes two of us," I said. "But since I came with permission from Miss Arden, and you're here without her, I'd say the balance tips my way." He frowned. "Helen sent you?" "That's right." He took a step closer. "What for?" "Questions. Wolfe's questions." That name hit him like a dart. His face tightened, but he recovered fast. "Wolfe. So she really wrote to him?" "Seems she did." Grover looked around the room, his eyes moving quick. "She was getting paranoid. Said someone was sending her things. Poisoned perfume, letters, velvet scraps. I told her to throw them out. She said she couldn't. Couldn't. She said she knew who was behind it, and throwing them away would only make it worse. That was Delia. Always had to make everything dramatic." He turned to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to let in a line of grey daylight. "Now she's dead, and I'm supposed to believe some invisible poison did it." "You don't." He dropped the curtain. "I believe she had a bad heart, or she made someone angry. Either way, she got what was coming. That was a little too easy for comfort. You seem remarkably calm for a man whose partner just died." His mouth curved. "You didn't know her like I did." He brushed past me on his way out. I let him go, watching the set of his shoulders, the stiffness in his gait. That wasn't grief. It was pressure, the kind that comes from holding something back. When the door clicked shut, I went back to the mantel. The atomizer was a work of art. Gold filigree, glass tinted faint pink. I held it to the light, turned the nozzle slightly, and got the faintest whiff of something floral and metallic. My eyes watered. Wolfe would have called that an empirical reaction. I called it a warning. A soft sound came from behind the half-closed study door, a whisper of motion, then silence. I went to it, slow and quiet. The door gave way to a smaller room, lined with books and scattered music sheets. On the desk was another square of velvet, this one darker, almost black. Beside it lay a photo of Delia with another woman, blonde, laughing, arm around her shoulders. The back of the photo was signed in looping script. For D, from Claudette. That name again, the rival, the singer, the next stop on my list. I left the apartment the same way I came, locking it behind me and taking the stairs 2 at a time. Outside, the air felt sharper, cleaner. I took a deep breath to wash out the perfume that still clung to my lungs. By the time I got back to the brownstone, it was past noon. Wolfe was at his desk, as if he hadn't moved since I left. The diary was open to another page. He didn't look up when I came in. "Report." I gave it to him straight. The apartment, the velvet squares, Grover's visit, the perfume. He listened without interruption, his eyes half shut, the tips of his fingers pressed together like a cathedral arch. When I finished, he asked, "You smelled it?" "I did. Once was enough." "Describe." "Like flowers and machinery, sweet and metallic. Not your average poison store fragrance." He nodded slowly. "Fritz will know. He once trained under a perfumer in Vienna. Bring him the sample, in a sealed glass." "You think it's real?" "Poison rarely lies," he said. "Only people do." I took the atomizer from my pocket, already wrapped in a handkerchief. Wolfe's nostrils flared, and for a moment his composure slipped. "Pfui," he muttered. "Hideous." I set it down on the tray and stepped back. He didn't touch it, just stared at it as if it were capable of speaking. "Archie," he said finally, "you will visit this Claudette Moray. Ask her how long beauty has been her profession, and whether she's begun to resent its expiration." I grinned. "That's poetic. I'll translate it into English." He waved a hand. "Do so, and bring me back a truth if you can find one. But handle her carefully, because she's dangerous, because she will seem not to be." That was Wolfe's way of telling me to keep both hands out of the fire and my heart out of reach, which meant, naturally, that I was already halfway burned. The Halcyon Club wasn't the kind of place where you walked in without a jacket and a good reason. Luckily, I had both, plus a name that made the doorman's eyebrows twitch: Claudette Morey. He looked me over, decided I might tip, and waved me toward the lounge with the faint disgust of a man who's seen better patrons. Inside, the air was thick with smoke, gin, and ambition. A pianist toyed with something slow and sentimental, the kind of tune that makes you feel guilty for being sober. Then the lights dimmed just enough, and she appeared, a flash of gold in the spotlight, a voice that could have made saints think twice. Claudette Morey. She was tall, poised, and curved in all the right directions. Her dress shimmered like liquid champagne, her hair a perfect frame of honey-blonde waves. If you didn't know she had once been Delia Vance's rival, you would have thought she'd invented the word grace. But there was something in her eyes when she sang, a kind of hunger carefully leashed. I stayed through her set, then made my move before the crowd could swarm her. The waiter pointed me to a small dressing room in the back, down a hallway that smelled of roses and disinfectant. I knocked. "Come in," she said, the voice lower now, but still carrying that practiced melody. The room was a shrine to vanity, mirrors rimmed with bulbs, perfume bottles like a jeweler's display, silk scarves hanging from hooks. She sat at the dressing table, dabbing a touch of powder along her neck, and caught my reflection in the mirror. "You're not with the club," she said. It wasn't a question. "No, ma'am. Archie Goodwin. I'm working for Nero Wolfe." The powder brush froze mid-air. Her eyes found mine in the mirror, and for a second, all that composure slipped. "Wolfe? The detective?" "The same. He's looking into the death of Delia Vance." The brush dropped softly onto the table. "Death," she repeated, barely above a whisper. "So it's true." She turned then, facing me fully. I heard something happened, but I didn't believe it. Delia was too careful, too proud. "Dead people often are," I said. "Heart failure officially. But she thought someone was poisoning her. She even left a note for Wolfe." "Poison?" The word trembled out of her, half disbelief, half fascination. "You think she was right?" "That's what I'm here to find out." "You knew her well." Claudette smiled faintly. "Once, we were competitors. In work, in men, in the mirror. But not enemies, not really. We understood each other too well for that." "Funny," I said. She didn't mention understanding anyone, especially not lately. Her expression shifted. Something small, almost guilt. We hadn't spoken in months. Not since she got involved with Alan Grover. I leaned on the wall. "Grover, you know him?" Everyone did. He had money, charm, and a talent for finding women who thought they were too smart for him. Delia was one of them. I warned her. "What about Dr. Emery Fenn? He's on our list, too." At that, her chin lifted slightly. "Fenn? He's harmless, a fool in a good suit. He adored Delia, of course. Everyone did. That was the problem." She stood, crossed to a small cabinet, and pulled out a bottle of cognac. "Drink." "Not when I'm working." "You always working?" she asked, pouring herself a glass anyway. "Only when the dead talk to my boss." She took a slow sip, watching me over the rim. "You think I killed her?" "I don't think anything yet. Wolfe does the thinking. I do the walking." A soft laugh escaped her, dry and musical. "Then walk carefully, Mr. Goodwin. Delia had a way of leaving ghosts in her wake." "Ghosts don't bother me. It's the living that tend to shoot." She smiled again. tighter this time. You're bold. Delia liked men like that. It always ended badly. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the photo I'd found in the study, the one with her arm around Delia. I laid it on the dressing table. You remember this? She looked down, her face softening. Yes. That was at the Orchid Room 3 years ago. We were performing together. It was the last time we were happy in the same room. Who took it? Alan. He was managing the event. Why? No reason yet, I said, though the fact that Grover's name kept coming up was beginning to feel less like coincidence and more like a thread Wolfe would yank on later. She turned back to the mirror, tracing her finger over the photograph. Delia was beautiful, but she was cruel. She couldn't help it. Every kindness had an edge. Every gift had a weight. Speaking of gifts, I said, she'd been getting a few before she died. Anonymous ones. Perfume, velvet, that sort of thing. Her hand stilled. Velvet. That ring a bell? She nodded slowly. Delia used to say velvet was her favorite texture. Said it reminded her of success, soft but dangerous if rubbed the wrong way. Did she ever tell you who was sending them? No, but she hinted it was someone who loved her once, or thought they did. She liked the attention. Claudette's voice dropped a note. We all did once. I was about to push further when a knock sounded at the door. A tall man with silver hair and too much confidence poked his head in. Claudette, darling, you're on again in 15. Thank you, Emery, she said smoothly. He smiled, gave me a polite once-over, and withdrew. When the door closed, I raised an eyebrow. That Fenn? Yes, the fool in the good suit. Seems more snake than fool. She smiled without humor. He can be both. Delia played him once. Badly. He never forgave her. That made the picture clearer, if not prettier. He see her recently. 3 nights ago. He came to the club looking for her. She wasn't here. He looked furious. Because she owed him money. That was enough for me. I pocketed the photo. Thanks for your time, Miss Morey. You've been very helpful. Be careful, Mr. Goodwin, she said as I opened the door. Delia's world had sharp corners. Even dead, she can still cut. Outside, the night had thickened, the kind of city fog that makes every streetlight look like a dying star. I took a cab back to 35th Street, thinking about Grover, Fenn, and the woman in gold who could smile while hiding knives behind her teeth. When I reached the brownstone, Wolfe was exactly where I'd left him, motionless, enormous, and waiting. Fritz had brought him coffee, untouched. Well, he said. She sang, she wept, she hinted. Claudette knew Delia, knew Grover, and definitely didn't like Fenn. Also, Fenn was at the club days before Delia died. Angry. Money involved. Money, Wolfe murmured. Always the bluntest instrument. He steepled his fingers. You perceive a pattern? I perceive 3 people who'd be happier if Delia had taken her curtain call early. He nodded once. Then we shall oblige them with an encore. I knew that tone. Somewhere in that vast brain, Nero Wolfe had found a line of attack. And when he did, someone was bound to squirm. The next morning began with the usual brownstone ritual. Coffee for me, beer for Wolfe, and a silence thick enough to slice. The case had moved into what he liked to call the gestational phase, where he chewed information instead of food. He hadn't spoken since I'd reported in the night before, and Fritz had learned long ago not to mistake that for disinterest. When Nero Wolfe went quiet, something was forming in that enormous head of his, something sharp. I was halfway through the newspaper when the phone rang. I reached for it, expecting Saul Panzer or maybe Inspector Kramer if we were unlucky. Instead, a soft female voice whispered, Mr. Goodwin, it's Helen Arden. That got my attention. Morning, Miss Arden. You sound like you're calling from inside a confession. I didn't know who else to reach. Something's happened. Start with where you are. At Delia's office, Grover's studio, I came to look for her personal things and her voice caught. It's been ransacked. I glanced at Wolfe. He'd opened one eye like a cat hearing the refrigerator door. I covered the receiver. Delia's office, tossed. He waved a hand for me to continue. Stay put, I told her. Touch nothing. I'm on my way. 20 minutes later, I was in a cab heading uptown. The studio occupied the second floor of a respectable midtown building, too clean for crime, too expensive for honesty. The hallway smelled of turpentine and secrets. Helen met me at the door, pale and trembling. It was like this when I came in, she said. Drawers pulled out, papers everywhere. She wasn't exaggerating. The place looked like it had been attacked by a committee of burglars. Filing cabinets yawned open, desk drawers gutted, a painting torn halfway off the wall. Whatever they'd been looking for, they hadn't found it, or they wanted us to think so. I crouched near the desk and picked up a crumpled piece of paper from the floor. It was an invoice from a chemist's shop, Chalmers and Burke, dated 2 weeks ago. The item list was simple. Compound number 47, 50 ml, private order. No address, just Delia's signature at the bottom. Helen hovered behind me. Do you think it means anything? Everything means something until Wolfe says otherwise. I slipped the paper into my pocket. Did Grover know you were coming here? No, I didn't tell anyone. Then how do you explain this? She swallowed. Maybe whoever killed her thought she'd left evidence here. Maybe. I stood, brushing dust off my sleeve. Or maybe they're just nervous that Wolfe's involved. She gave a faint, frightened smile. That would make anyone nervous. While she gathered a few undamaged papers, I poked through the rest of the office. A shattered perfume bottle lay near the window, its scent still sharp in the air. Same sweet, metallic tang as the one from Delia's apartment. There was also a velvet ribbon tangled around the curtain cord, a familiar purple shade. Someone wanted to remind us the Velvet Death hadn't finished speaking. As I bent to pick it up, a shadow darkened the doorway. Alan Grover stood there, jaw tight, eyes colder than a February wind. Goodwin, he said flatly. Breaking and entering again. I straightened. Funny, I was about to ask you the same thing. His gaze flicked to Helen. What's she doing here? She works here, doesn't she? Or did? We came to collect what's left of Miss Vance's things. He stepped inside, looking around with theatrical disgust. Someone's been busy. You wouldn't happen to know who. If I did, I'd tell the police. But I'll bet my last dollar it's Fenn. He was obsessed with Delia. Probably thought she'd hidden his precious money somewhere. Helen's chin lifted. That's a lie. Grover smiled thinly. Sweetheart, everything about Delia was a lie, and now it's coming apart. I stepped between them. Easy, friend. Save the drama for your clients. Miss Arden's had enough excitement for one day. He sneered, but backed off. You tell Wolfe to stay out of this. He's got no business prying into things he doesn't understand. I grinned. You can tell him yourself, if you're brave enough to step into the brownstone. He glared, then turned on his heel and left, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the glass. Helen sagged into the nearest chair. He's lying, isn't he? Probably. But he's also scared, and that's more useful. I locked up behind us and put her in a cab home, then headed back to Wolfe. He was in the office, as always, sipping beer and studying an open volume on toxicology. Without looking up, he said, You smell of nervousness and cheap perfume. What have you found? I laid the invoice and velvet ribbon on his desk. Delia ordered something from a chemist 2 weeks ago. Private compound, whatever that means. The office was tossed, Grover dropped by to growl, and I found this ribbon hanging from the curtain. Wolfe's nostrils twitched at the faint scent still clinging to it. Compound, number 47, he murmured. Archie, call Saul Panzer. Have him visit Chalmers and Burke discreetly. obtain their purchase records, particularly any orders placed under fictitious names. Think Delia was buying poison? He gave me a look that could curdle cream. Poison, perfume. It is often a matter of intent. Women purchase one when they wish to attract, the other when they wish to conclude. Romantic as ever, I said. Pooh. Romance is merely chemistry misapplied. While he dictated a note to Fritz to store the velvet sample, I filled him in on Grover's behavior. Wolfe listened with half-closed eyes. When I mentioned Fenn's supposed obsession, his lids lifted. Ah, the doctor, the fool in the good suit. The same. He leaned back. Invite him here. Tomorrow evening, 8 o'clock. I should like to hear his version of events before someone else is found dead. I hesitated. You expecting that? Someone has already broken into a studio and risked exposure. Desperation accelerates recklessness, and when poison is one's trade, the margin for error narrows fatally. Fritz entered with a tray of sandwiches, which Wolfe ignored. His gaze had gone distant again, his fingers tapping the armrest in slow rhythm. Archie, he said quietly, this velvet motif, do you see what it implies? Only that someone's got a flair for the dramatic. Not dramatic, he corrected. Symbolic. Velvet is soft, concealing. It absorbs light, and it smothers. That sent a chill crawling up my neck. Find Fenn, he continued. But take care. He will lie with sincerity, as only a frightened man can. I went to make the call, wondering not for the first time how a man who never left his chair could see so clearly into the murk the rest of us had to wade through. Behind me, Wolfe sighed. Deep, slow, final. The velvet death, he murmured. A beautiful weapon, but a clumsy hand wields it. We shall soon see whose hand that is. It wasn't a promise. It was a verdict, already sealed. By the time I reached Dr. Emery Fenn's office the next day, I had already rehearsed 3 versions of the conversation in my head. One polite, one firm, and one for when things got ugly. The man's reputation was a curious one. A physician who dabbled in finance, known for helping distressed clients manage their money and, occasionally, their conscience. He operated out of a sleek suite near Madison Avenue that smelled faintly of antiseptic and pride. The receptionist gave me a professional smile that wilted when I mentioned Nero Wolfe's name. Dr. Fenn will see you, she said, in a tone suggesting she'd rather I saw a firing squad. The office itself was a study in restraint. Mahogany, steel, and silence. Fenn was behind his desk, a tall man with silver hair, the kind of silver that comes from vanity, not years. He stood to greet me, extending a hand that was steady, manicured, and cold. Mr. Goodwin, he said. I've heard of you. Mr. Wolfe's assistant. Technically his legs and ears. Sometimes his voice when he's too bored to speak. He smiled, the kind that never reaches the eyes. How quaint. You're here about Delia. That's right. She's dead. You were one of the last to see her alive. He gestured to a chair and I took it. I was her physician, yes, but that doesn't mean I killed her, despite what the gossip might suggest. Funny, I said. I didn't mention killing. He chuckled softly, folding his hands. You didn't need to. That's what everyone thinks when a woman dies suddenly and men are involved. Then help me think otherwise. You saw her 3 nights before she died. What happened? He leaned back, gaze turning inward. She was agitated, pale, complaining of dizziness and nausea. I examined her. No traceable poison, nothing irregular in her pulse or lungs. She insisted she was being poisoned by scent. Some nonsense about a perfume or velvet. You didn't believe her? Would you? His tone sharpened. Delia thrived on drama. If she couldn't find it, she created it. I told her to rest, avoid stimulants, and see me again in 2 days. She never came. Did you give her anything? He frowned. Only a mild sedative. Harmless. Compound number 47 mean anything to you? The change in his face was almost invisible, but I caught it, the faint tightening around the eyes. I'm not familiar. Sure about that? Chalmers and Burke chemists. Private order 2 weeks ago, signed by her. He hesitated, just long enough to count as confession. Then she didn't tell me, he said finally. Delia liked her secrets, especially chemical ones. I let the silence stretch. He filled it as men like him always do. Alan Grover was the one supplying her with strange concoctions. Perfumes, oils, powders. He fancied himself an alchemist. I warned her against him. That's generous of you, considering he says you were obsessed with her. His composure cracked a fraction. He would say that. Grover is a parasite. Delia pitied him, which is the cruelest gift she could give. He mistook it for affection. Did you ever lend her money? He exhaled through his nose. A small sum, nothing worth killing over. Everything's worth killing over if you pick the right day, I said. You're invited to Wolfe's house tonight, 8 o'clock. He'd like to hear you confirm your innocence in person. His eyebrows lifted. Wolfe never leaves his chair, but expects others to dance attendance. Charming. Tell him I'm a busy man. Tell him yourself. Or don't, and let him draw conclusions. He's very good at that. I left him staring after me, jaw set, eyes hard. Men who talk about innocence usually do so for their own benefit. Back at the Brownstone, Wolfe was in conference with Fritz, who was describing something aromatic and alarming for dinner. When I reported in, he dismissed Fritz with a nod and gestured for the account. As I spoke, he didn't move except to reach for his beer. When I mentioned Fenn's reaction to Compound 47, his eyes narrowed. Ah, so he knows. Knows or fears it, I said. Either way, his poker face could use a tune-up. He closed his eyes, murmuring, Compound 47. The number is deliberate, not pharmaceutical, but proprietary. He opened them again. It was the chemist's creation, a perfume base, perhaps. Toxicity would depend on concentration and binding agent. Meaning we are dealing with vanity turned lethal. That was Wolfe for someone weaponized perfume. The doorbell rang. Fritz returned, ushering in Saul Panzer. Saul looked pleased, which meant he'd found something unpleasant. He handed Wolfe a small envelope. Chalmers and Burke records, he said. Private order placed by Delia Vance. But here's the kicker. It was paid for by someone else. Who? Wolfe asked. Saul smiled faintly. Alan Grover. Cash. 2 weeks ago. I let out a low whistle. Our velvet man again. Wolfe's eyes gleamed. Indeed. He buys the poison. She dies believing herself its victim, and yet he remains untouched. Curious. What's the play? I asked. We invite them all, Wolfe said simply. Tonight. Miss Arden, Grover, Dr. Fenn, Miss Morey. I detest the intrusion, but the Brownstone will suffer it. Big house meeting, I said. Always a pleasure. Archie, arrange it, he said, closing his eyes, and have Fritz open the windows after. I will not have the air fouled by guilt and perfume. I made the calls. Fenn tried to refuse until I mentioned Wolfe's interest in the police's opinion of chemical procurement. Grover laughed, said he'd enjoy seeing the old man try. Claudette Morey hesitated, then agreed. Helen Arden simply said, I'll come, her voice quiet but resolute. By the time the last call ended, twilight was creeping across the windows. The house felt heavier somehow, as if it knew it was about to host something unpleasant. Wolfe sat in his chair, fingers pressed together, the faintest smile on his lips. Archie, he said softly, tonight we shall peel velvet from flesh, and beneath we will find what always lies there." "What's that?" I asked. "Envy," he said. "Always envy." And as the city darkened beyond the glass, I knew he was right, because whatever had killed Delia Vance wasn't just poison, it was pride with a scent. By 7 that evening, the brownstone had the nervous air of a stage before curtain. Wolfe naturally was unflustered. He never is. But Fritz had that tight, polite tension he gets when outsiders are coming for dinner but won't be staying for dessert. I'd cleared the office of anything fragile, aired the room per orders, and set out the chairs in a semicircle like an audience waiting for confession. Wolfe sat behind his desk, hands folded, eyes half closed in what looked like a nap but wasn't. He was listening to the building, the ticking of the clock, the weight of expectation. The first to arrive was Helen Arden, punctual and pale, her composure holding by threads. She sat quietly near the corner, clutching her handbag like it held her last ounce of courage. Then Claudette Morey came, wrapped in fur and confidence, trailing a perfume Wolfe sniffed once before muttering, "Phooey." Grover followed, loud, smirking, pretending to find the whole affair amusing, though his hands twitched when he thought no one saw. Fenn arrived last, dignified and annoyed, as if he'd been summoned to a medical malpractice hearing beneath his notice. Once they were all seated, Wolfe opened his eyes. The room stilled. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice a slow, deliberate current, "I am not inclined to theatricality. But Miss Vance's death, though labeled natural, is an offense against nature itself. I detest offense." Grover chuckled. "We're here for a sermon, then." Wolfe ignored him completely. Miss Vance believed she was poisoned. She was not wrong. She was dying from exposure to a volatile toxin, a synthetic compound used in perfume manufacture, misapplied in lethal concentration. Compound number 47. Fenn straightened. "That's absurd. The autopsy found nothing of the kind." Wolfe's gaze shifted toward him, heavy and unhurried. "You would know, Doctor, if the autopsy had been complete. It was not. The compound mimics a cardiac event when inhaled gradually. Your conclusion of heart failure was convenient, and your oversight, curious." Fenn's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Wolfe continued, "The compound was commissioned by Miss Vance, but purchased by Mr. Grover. A strange transaction, yes? The giver pays for the poison he means to accuse another of using." Grover leaned forward, color rising. "You've got no proof. I bought it for her perfume business. She wanted something original." "Indeed. But she had already broken partnership with you weeks before. You paid in cash, concealing the order. That is not generosity, Mr. Grover. It is premeditation." Helen flinched. Claudette's eyes narrowed. "Delia Vance was not your victim alone," Wolfe went on. "She was the axis around which all of you turned. Envy, desire, dependence. Miss Morey resented her fame. Dr. Fenn, her rejection. Mr. Grover, her control. And Miss Arden, perhaps, her shadow." Helen's voice broke softly. "I loved her. She trusted me." "Yes," Wolfe said gently. "Enough to make you her witness. Not enough to make you safe." He leaned back slightly, eyes closing for a breath before reopening, sharp again. The ransacked office, the broken bottle, the scraps of velvet, these were not random. Someone sought to erase proof. But the velvet, impregnated with residue of compound 47, survived. My analysis this afternoon confirmed it. Grover stood abruptly. "That's ridiculous. You're making up evidence." I moved to intercept him just in case, but Wolfe raised one finger. Grover froze. "The fatal irony," Wolfe said, his tone now silk over steel, "is that the poisoner was poisoned by his own device. You handled the compound repeatedly, Mr. Grover. It absorbed into your skin. Your tremor, your pallor, they betray exposure. You are, at present, dying by inches as she did. For a long second, no one breathed. Grover's hand shook visibly as he reached for his collar, sweat beading his temple. "That's insane," he whispered. "You can't know that." "I can," Wolfe replied calmly. "Fritz will call an ambulance, though it will do little good. You may live 2 days, perhaps 3. Enough time to sign a statement. Confession will not save you, but it will end speculation." Grover sank back into the chair, face ashen. Claudette turned away, one hand trembling against her mouth. Fenn's composure fractured completely. His voice cracked, thin and angry. "You tricked him." "I enlightened him," Wolfe said, "which is crueler, I admit." He looked to Helen. "Miss Arden, I suggest you retrieve Miss Vance's remaining papers from the authorities. They will be returned to you after formal closure. I trust you will not let her story be rewritten." Helen nodded faintly, tears standing in her eyes. The room was silent again. Wolfe exhaled heavily, closing his eyes once more. "Archie, see them out. The air has become intolerably human." When they'd gone and the last door shut, I turned to him. "You really think Grover's dying?" He opened one eye. "I do. He was careless. Vanity is a poor glove for handling death." He reached for his beer, lifted it with a sigh. "Fritz may serve dinner now." I watched him take that first slow sip, his expression unreadable. "Well," I said, "that's one way to disinfect the brownstone." He looked at me over the rim of his glass. "Archie, men like Grover invent poison to kill the soul before the body. He merely reversed the order." And that was that. The curtain lowered, the house still. The velvet death had done its work, and in Nero Wolfe's world, justice, like dinner, was always served precisely on time. It was nearly midnight when I returned to the office after escorting the guests, or what was left of them, out of the brownstone. The air still carried that faint scent of Claudette's perfume, though Wolfe had insisted Fritz open the windows the moment the door closed behind the last of them. For all the man's talk about hating human disturbance, he seemed to know exactly how much of it the brownstone could absorb before it needed purging. Wolfe was still seated, eyes closed, hands steepled, looking for all the world like a judge at rest after sentencing the guilty. On the desk sat the empty glass from his final beer, condensation forming lazy patterns on the coaster. I leaned against the doorframe, waiting for the explosion that usually came after a case concluded, the philosophical thunderstorm that followed his intellectual lightning. But for once, he was quiet. "Fritz says Grover's already at Mount Sinai," I said after a while. "They called Kramer when he collapsed in the cab. I imagine the inspectors thrilled you solved another one without giving him a headline." Wolfe grunted softly. "Kramer may have his headlines. I prefer digestion." "Yeah," I said, dropping into my chair. "But you don't often hand a murderer his own death warrant and call it dinner." He opened one eye, then the other. "I did not hand him anything. He chose to drink of his own cup. Poetic symmetry, I permit it on occasion. Sure, you're a regular bard of moral equilibrium." He didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he looked toward the orchids through the open door. "Do you see, Archie, how vanity corrupts the intellect?" Grover imagined himself clever enough to weaponize fragrance. He failed to understand that true subtlety requires restraint. He wished to make her suffer, to watch her beauty fade before death. And so he lingered too long, touched what he should not, breathed what he had built. Inevitably, it entered him. I nodded. "You think he meant to frame someone?" "Fenn, maybe. Perhaps. He spread the poison across several avenues. A good lie requires confusion. But he was clumsy. His hands were guided by malice, not precision." Wolfe leaned forward slightly, voice dropping into that tone that always meant the case was turning into a lecture. "Miss Vance's tragedy was that she mistook obsession for admiration. She collected devotions as others collect art, and art, like poison, demands containment. She permitted none." meaning she played too many hearts and lost track of which one was ticking down. Crude, but correct. Fritz entered then, silent as a priest, bearing a small covered tray. Wolfe lifted the lid, sniffed, and nodded approval. I caught the faint aroma of truffles and something buttery that made my stomach remember I hadn't eaten since lunch. "Hungry?" I asked. "You know I despise interruptions while eating," he said, reaching for his fork. "Then I'll talk," I said. "Helen Arden called me before she left. Said she'd take care of Delia's remaining estate. What little's left after the vultures. She's grateful, by the way." "Gratitude," he muttered, "is an emotion often expressed by those who do not yet understand what they owe." "She sounded more relieved than grateful," I said. "Like she's finally breathing again." "That is relief," Wolfe said, chewing slowly. "It will not last. Miss Arden will find herself envied for her proximity to tragedy. People romanticize poison, Archie. They will write that Delia died for love, not vanity. It makes the stench more palatable." I stretched, watching him eat in silence for a moment. "You really think Grover won't survive?" He dabbed his lips with the napkin. "The dosage he absorbed would fell a smaller man in hours. His vitality might prolong it, but the end will be the same. He will die as she did, beautifully and painfully." I whistled low. "Justice with flair. You're getting sentimental." "Phooey. Sentimentality is the last refuge of dullards. This is symmetry. I merely appreciate the aesthetic." When he finished, he pushed back the plate, exhaled, and reached for his beer. The faint hiss of the cap breaking was the only sound for several seconds. He raised the glass. "To the folly of ambition," he said. I clinked my coffee cup against it, "and to clients who don't send letters that smell like doom." He allowed the ghost of a smile. "Archie, doom rarely announces itself. It arrives wrapped in perfume and velvet, smiling." The clock chimed 12. I stood, stretching. "You're a philosopher when you're full." "Better full than foolish," he said. "Turn out the lights, please. We've had enough of velvet shadows for one evening." As I flicked the switch and the office fell into soft darkness, I caught one last look at him, massive, still, unshakable, framed against the faint glow of the orchids beyond. The brownstone exhaled as if reclaiming its peace. Outside, the city moved on, careless as ever. Inside, Nero Wolfe lifted his glass once more, murmuring something to himself I almost didn't catch. "Beauty kills slowly," he said, "but it never kills alone." Then he drank, and the night, like the case, settled into silence. The next morning came grey and uneasy, like the city itself was trying to shake off the residue of last night's confession. I came downstairs expecting to find Wolfe in his usual fortress of calm. But the office felt different, emptier somehow, like the case had left behind a draft. The air still carried a faint ghost of that cursed perfume. Wolfe had already started his morning beer, and Fritz was in the kitchen, making enough noise to suggest he was exorcising the last of the guests from his pots and pans. I dropped into my chair, yawning. "Morning, boss. News says Grover's in critical condition at Mount Sinai. Police found traces of the compound on his clothes and hands. Kramer's ecstatic. I think he wants to send you flowers." Wolfe looked up from his paper with mild disgust. "If he does, tell him to send sausages. Flowers are for graves. Suit yourself. The papers are calling it the Velvet Death Affair. You're getting more column inches than usual." He grunted, which for Wolfe was both acknowledgement and disdain. "They will, of course, miss the point entirely." "Sure," I said. "To them it's a fancy story about a jealous man and a dead beauty. To you, it's a moral treatise on the consequences of vanity. To me, it's another Tuesday." He glanced at me over the rim of his glass. "You jest, but you are not entirely wrong. The essence of such crimes is not love or money. It is wounded pride. That is the slowest poison." Before I could reply, the phone rang. Fritz called from the hall. "It is Inspector Kramer, Mr. Wolfe." Wolfe sighed. "Put him through." The receiver crackled. Kramer's voice came in hot, as usual. "Wolfe, you happy now? You've scared a confession out of a dying man. Grover's been raving about velvet and vengeance all night." "Raving is not confessing, Inspector." "Yeah, well, it's good enough for me. He signed a statement before collapsing again. The chemists verified everything you said. He's finished, but there's one thing." Wolfe waited. Kramer's voice dropped lower. "That compound you identified, it's been turning up in 2 other cases. Deaths that looked natural until toxicology dug deeper. Same perfume base, same formula number. Someone's been selling the stuff under the counter." I straightened. Wolfe's expression barely changed, but I saw his pupils narrow a fraction. "Where?" he asked. "One was a dancer in Chicago. The other a banker's wife in Boston. Both liked rare fragrances. Both had bottles traced to the same lab. Chalmers and Burke. You might have tripped over something bigger than your fancy dinner party." "I'm not surprised," Wolfe said evenly. "Vanity is an exportable commodity." Kramer snorted. "I'll keep you posted. Don't go running any more private tribunals without me." The line clicked dead. I turned to Wolfe. "So the Velvet Death has legs. You going to chase them?" He frowned slightly. "Chase? No. Observe, perhaps. It appears I've drawn back a curtain wider than intended." "Meaning there's a manufacturer behind Grover's little chemistry project?" "Precisely. He was a client, not a creator. Someone crafted the poison, sold it under the guise of art, that someone may yet profit from further tragedy." I leaned forward. "You thinking of getting involved again?" He took a slow sip of beer, eyes half-lidded. "If necessity compels. But for now, the contagion is moral, not legal. The authorities may chase the symptoms. I prefer to study the cause." "You mean vanity?" He nodded once. "It will always seek new form. Today perfume, tomorrow politics. There is no end to man's desire to be admired, nor to his willingness to die for it." I stood, stretching. "Then let the world handle its own toxins. We've earned a quiet day." "You have," he said. "I have orchids to attend. Their beauty, at least, is innocent." He rose, slow and deliberate, and disappeared toward the greenhouse, the faint scent of earth and humidity drifting after him. I stayed a while longer, watching the light crawl across his empty chair. The brownstone was silent again, back to its old rhythm, but something about the quiet felt thinner now, as if the walls themselves were listening for another letter to arrive, one sealed in wax, scented in danger. Maybe it would. Maybe not. Either way, Nero Wolfe would be ready, beer in hand, mind sharpened like a blade that never rusts. And I'd be right here, notebook open, waiting for the next whisper of trouble to knock on the door. 3 days passed before the next ripple broke the calm surface of the brownstone. Wolfe had gone back to his routines. Orchids from 9 to 11, lunch at 1, and complete avoidance of anything resembling human emotion in between. I was starting to think the whole Velvet Death business had wrapped up tidy for once. That illusion lasted until the morning mail came. Fritz brought in the tray with the precision of a man handling relics. On top was a single gray envelope, no return address, the handwriting elegant and deliberate, the kind that tells you the writer either has money or wants you to think they do. Wolfe didn't look up from his book until the scent reached him. It wasn't perfume exactly, more like the faint echo of something chemical trying to be floral. He frowned. "Archie." "Already on it," I said, taking the envelope. "No wax seal this time, just class and bad intentions." I slid the letter opener through and unfolded the paper. "Mr. Wolfe, the world has a way of misattributing genius. Your interference has disrupted a careful experiment. Grover was a fool and deserved his fate, but his error should not indict the design. You exposed a symptom, not the source. I trust your intellect will not rest content with partial truths. Should curiosity compel you, follow the scent. A friend of refinement. There was no signature, no hint of origin beyond the faint lingering aroma that made the back of my throat itch. I handed it over. Wolfe read it twice, slowly, then set it beside his beer as if it were an insect he intended to classify later. "Pooh," he muttered finally. "Someone presumes to compliment me while issuing a challenge. Detestable. Someone also knows what Grover was really up to," I said, "and that you nailed him." "That," he said, "is the only interesting part." He tapped the envelope with a finger. "The handwriting is disciplined but not native. European, perhaps, and the phrasing, a careful experiment, suggests a scientist or artisan. Not a criminal seeking profit, but one seeking recognition. Someone who sells death with a bow on top," I said. "You going to take the bait?" He leaned back, considering. "Curiosity is a dangerous indulgence, but deliberate provocation is worse. If this writer imagines he can manipulate me through vanity, he will be disappointed." Still, his voice trailed off. I knew that tone. He was hooked. By afternoon, I was downtown with Saul Panzer, tracing the chemical trail at Chalmers and Burke. The chemist who handled Grover's order, a timid man named Burke, no relation to the deadlier half of his company's name, was nervous as a rabbit in a dog park. He swore they'd filled only one order for Compound 47, but the records told a different story. A duplicate invoice had been filed under a false client name, Maison Liore, a boutique perfume distributor with offices in Paris and a warehouse in Newark. When I called Wolfe from the payphone, he was almost smug. "Maison Liore," he said. "An old brand, recently revived by a French chemist named Henri Duval. He specializes in olfactory innovation, or as you would say, fancy poisons. You've heard of him?" "I read," he said. "Unlike most men." By the time I got back to the brownstone, he had a file on the man, press clippings, articles, and an advertisement for a perfume exhibition at the Waldorf scheduled for the next evening. The tagline read, "Where scent becomes soul." "Sounds like our guy," I said. "Undoubtedly," Wolfe replied. "A man who toys with the boundaries of mortality and artistry would not resist public applause. He will attend, and he will believe himself safe among his admirers. You plan on crashing his party. Crashing implies haste. I intend to arrive." Now, Wolfe leaving the brownstone was as rare as Fritz cooking something ordinary. But that evening, the impossible happened. He agreed to go, on one condition. "Archie, you will arrange a private reception room. I will not stand like a penguin in a ballroom while people babble about notes of bergamot." The next night, the Waldorf glittered like sin in evening wear. Guests milled through the exhibition hall sniffing ribbons, dabbing wrists, and speaking in reverent tones about olfactory signatures. Wolfe sat in a cordoned lounge, his bulk an immovable monument amid the perfume-clouded air. I played escort, keeping an eye on the crowd until I saw him, a tall man with a shock of white hair and the kind of immaculate suit that screams continental success. Henri Duval. I brought him over. Wolfe didn't rise, of course. He simply regarded Duval with that level stare that made men confess things they didn't know they'd done. "Monsieur Duval," Wolfe said, "your reputation precedes you, a chemist who courts art and danger in equal measure." Duval smiled faintly. "And yours, monsieur, as a man who dislikes both." "Dislike?" Wolfe said softly. "On the contrary, I detest misuse. You have applied genius to death." Duval's smile didn't falter. "Ah, so you received my letter?" "I did. You flatter yourself calling this an experiment. Murder is an inelegant substitute for philosophy." The Frenchman's gaze cooled. "You misunderstand. My work is pure. The women who wore my perfumes wanted immortality. I granted it. Grover was crude. He tainted perfection with ego. I create art, not corpses. Wolfe leaned forward slightly. Art that kills is still homicide. You dressed it in velvet, but it remains decay. Duval's composure flickered. You cannot prove. Phooey. Proof is for courtrooms. I prefer certainty. I know you distributed the compound under false names, that Grover was your instrument, and that you continue to sell this poison disguised as scent. The police will soon know it too. Duval's nostrils flared. You would destroy me for what? Principle? For equilibrium, Wolfe said, and because your arrogance offends me. That was when Saul Panzer stepped from the crowd, followed by 2 detectives Kramer had sent at Wolfe's request. Duval went white, realizing the trap had already been sprung. His flask of sample perfume was confiscated. 1 whiff confirmed Wolfe's diagnosis. Back at the brownstone, later that night, Wolfe was quiet again, staring at the orchids while I poured coffee. You had Kramer on standby the whole time, I said. You planned that? Of course. Duval's kind cannot resist display. He would rather be caught than ignored. Wolfe sighed, heavy and satisfied. The true poison, Archie, was never chemical. It was conceit. It kills everything it touches, including genius. Guess that makes you immune, I said. He allowed a small, smug smile. Hardly, but I have the antidote. Reason. I raised my cup. To reason. He raised his glass in return, and to the folly of men who perfume their crimes. Outside, the city hummed on, unaware that somewhere in its veins, a new velvet death had been stopped. Inside the brownstone, the air was clear again, save for the faintest trace of orchids, living, fragile, and perfectly innocent. The city was quiet that night, the kind of quiet that comes after a storm. Not peace, exactly. Just exhaustion wearing a mask. The newspapers were already full of the story. Perfumer arrested in international poison plot, complete with pictures of Henri Duval looking insulted rather than afraid. Wolfe's name didn't appear naturally. He preferred it that way. Inside the brownstone, the air was warm, steady, and human again. Fritz was in the kitchen humming something German and complicated. The orchids upstairs were getting their last misting of the day, and Nero Wolfe was in his chair, the world's heaviest mind at rest. I was across from him, nursing coffee and looking over my notes for the agency's books. It should have felt routine, but it didn't. The case had left a residue, like the perfume itself. Wolfe broke the silence first. Archie, he said, eyes still closed, you recall what I said to Duval about conceit being the true poison? I remember. Hard to forget when you deliver a line like that in front of half the city's elite. He opened his eyes, the faintest spark of amusement there. I was not performing. I was stating a diagnosis. Duval believed himself an artist, not a criminal. That is why he failed. A true artist knows his creation must serve beauty, not vanity. I smirked. You'd make a fine philosopher if you weren't such a practical man. Pui, he said. Philosophers only rearrange ignorance. I prefer knowledge. He leaned forward slightly, fingers steepled. Consider the chain, Archie. Grover, driven by jealousy, thought he could punish Miss Vance through fear. Fenn, blinded by pride, misread her distress and dismissed her suffering as hysteria. Claudette envied her, Helen worshipped her, and all of them mistook emotion for power. Duval simply supplied the mechanism. It was not one crime, but 5, each an act of ego. I had to admit, when he laid it out like that, it sounded almost like music. And you, of course, were the conductor. He gave a small grunt of satisfaction. Merely the audience who refused to applaud. There was something in his tone, though, a softness that didn't come often. Maybe it was fatigue, or the faint melancholy that follows justice when it's done too neatly. The world outside our walls would keep turning, poisoning itself in new ways, and he knew it. Kramer called again, I said. They're tracing Duval's buyers. Seems the compound reached farther than anyone thought. He'd been supplying high society clients who wanted exclusive perfumes. Some bottles may have been harmless. Some weren't. Wolfe's lips thinned. Exclusivity, another form of vanity. People will inhale anything if they believe it sets them apart. Idiocy has never lacked perfume. I chuckled. So, what now? You going to write an essay for the Gazette on the ethics of aromatic homicide? He ignored that. We will hear no more of it. The matter is concluded. That, of course, was Wolfe's polite way of saying the subject was dead, literally and otherwise. But I wasn't quite done. You ever think about Delia Vance herself? I mean, the way she saw it. She thought she was dying by beauty. That's almost poetic. He frowned. Poetry is indulgence. She was a woman destroyed by her own appetites. She sought admiration instead of affection, applause instead of understanding, a predictable end. Still, I said, she had style. Style without substance, he said, is merely costume, and costumes burn easily. He reached for his beer, pausing mid-motion. Archie, tell me, what of Miss Arden? She's settled Delia's affairs. Sold what was left of the studio. Says she's leaving New York for good. Somewhere quieter. Vermont, maybe. Ah, he nodded slowly. Sensible woman. When the air's fouled, retreat to higher altitude. I smiled. You could try that yourself sometime. Archie, he said dryly, my altitude is intellectual, not geographic. That earned a laugh from me, which he pretended to find irritating but didn't. The room had relaxed again, the case fading into the comfortable background hum of the brownstone. I could hear Fritz moving about in the kitchen, the faint clink of china, the smell of something rich and buttery, sneaking under the door. Wolfe took his beer, tilted it slightly toward the orchids as if offering a toast to their innocence, and said, We have witnessed another demonstration of human frailty. I'm reminded. That man is a fool, I finished. Not precisely, he said. That man is ingenious in his pursuit of foolishness. He drank, eyes closing in satisfaction. It is a consistent flaw, reliable even. Were it otherwise, we should both be out of work. True enough, I said, but I'd take a quiet week anyway. Quiet, he murmured. A most elusive condition. It will last until the next knock upon that door. I knew he was right. It always happened like that. Peace until the world's next foolishness decided to intrude. I stood, stretching. Dinner in 10 minutes, according to Fritz. I think he's doing something sinful with pheasant. Good, bring the Madeira. Anything else? Yes, he said, eyes opening again. Sharp now, alive. Remind me to order more orchids. The air needs cleansing. I grinned. You mean the city's or yours? He didn't answer, but there was a flicker at the corner of his mouth that might have been amusement or philosophy, pretending not to smile. I went to fetch the wine, and behind me I heard him sigh, not heavily, but with finality. Beauty, he said to no one in particular, is a poor companion for truth, yet they find each other so often. That was Nero Wolfe in a nutshell. Eating, thinking, and handing down moral verdicts that sounded like scripture, written by a man too intelligent to believe in saints. When I returned with the bottle, he was already unfolding his napkin, ready for the one ceremony he still trusted completely. Dinner. The orchids glowed faintly in the soft light, unpoisoned, perfect. The world outside could keep its vanity. Inside the brownstone, order had been restored, and as I poured the wine, he gave a small grunt that passed for approval. The case of the Velvet Death had closed, not with a bang, not even with applause, but with the sound of silverware, a sigh of contentment, and a final truth settling quietly into place. Justice, like Wolfe himself, had a taste for precision. And tonight, it was perfectly seasoned, 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 perfectly seasoned.